Hey everybody, this is Ann and welcome back to Painting Big. Today I have a double feature for you. We're going to do a very simple rundown on NMM chainmail, and we're also going to talk about what happens if the blade that you're trying to paint is vertical instead of horizontal. Alright, let's get to it. Alright, so last time in our first NMM video, we did this guy with the horizontal, mostly, sword, right? It's at an angle, but more or less it's horizontal. It's going this way. It's not going vertically. So the thing is, when you've got a blade like this, you know where the light is coming from usually, right? You're like, okay, light's top down, so the upper edge gets the higher highlight, the upper edge gets all the stuff, right? You know where your highlight is, you know where your shadow is. When you start dealing with a blade that's vertical, then you kind of have question marks going on, right? Maybe if your light is coming from this direction, then your choice is pretty obvious, right? Your light is coming from this direction, so this will be your lighter side. But what about when you're just doing a general zenith? What about like that? Well, okay, so a couple of schools of thought here. One, you can choose either. As you can see, my zenith here would indicate choosing this one. You could also choose the outer one. Compositionally, there are good choices and bad choices. So if the blade is being carried close to the body, like a sword that's like vertically held next to, like, the figure is leaning on a sword, then it's pretty evident, right? In that case, the inner edge is going to be darker, because it's up against the figure and light's not going to fall as easily there. If we get closer, you can even see that. You can see that shadow that's falling there when I tilt the model in line with the light source. You can see that that's in shadow, right? So in that case, having the shadow edge next to the figure makes sense. However, when you're dealing with something that's just straight up vertical and tends to be closer to the figure's torso or head, then I would argue that the logical choice is to actually choose the interior surface, the surface that is closest to the figure. Why? Because you're going to be putting a lot of like flashy highlights on that, right? A lot of kind of drama. And so it's going to draw the eye. And if you can, you always want to draw the eye toward the important part of the figure, which is going to be this torso and face. So if we zoom out, you can see that. If you put highlights on the other side over here, you're kind of pulling the eye out here, and that's just going off into nothing, right? Because off here is just whatever is outside of the figure. We have no idea. But if you keep your highlights more focused toward the center of the figure, then you're going to draw the attention of the viewer and keep it more or less here. So I would argue that that's probably the best solution, would be to put your lighter side of the blade on the interior closer to the figure. When you've got little scrolly bits like this, kind of choose to depict them as if they're welded on. They're decorative, right? So I would probably put a little bit of a dark line. By the way, if you ever do that and you want to thin down your line, but you're terrible at drawing lines, just take like your original color here and put that on instead. You can usually get much closer. Like, you can thin down the line this way from going at it from the outside, and then you don't have to actually draw a really thin line. You just have to like bring your outside color really close. You might still wipe out some of it, this is true, but yeah. So then if we do this way, I'm just going to block in really quick because I don't want this video to be very long. You've got a reflected light still on the outer edge, right? So you're good there. We'll talk more about doing like little filigree bits and stuff like these little curly cues in a future video. But since we're trying to keep this very simple for people who are just learning NMM, very, very simple. We put our shadow, remember, on the other side of the blade. It's an angled blade, so it's easy. Other side of the blade from the highlight. And then we want to kind of blend it up a little bit, blend it out toward this outer edge where we've got that second highlight. And remember, we want to edge with our white. Just like with any other blade, you could put a couple of different highlights on here. So like we could put a highlight there, and then we could say, okay, well, there's also one here. And it's natural to want to highlight toward the tip of the weapon, so that's perfectly doable. If you want something more realistic, I'd recommend going to places like Renaissance fairs, someplace where you can go to a blacksmith shop, look at a bunch of actual weapons out in nature in an overhead light, and kind of take a look at what happens. Studying from nature is always the ultimate answer when it comes to depicting something that looks real, right? But just while we're studying that, we can see how that's coming together. So we just had to pretty much pick a side. And then we end up with something that looks pretty decent. Again, I could spend time with finessing this. I'm not going to right now. But you can see I'm pretty much just doing that one line shadow instead of a bunch of different undulating shadows. That's because this is more narrow. So you have less room to do everything, right? With this big chonky weapon, you have a lot of room. And we'll talk about doing more delicate blades as we get further into this series as well. All right. But there you go. Just pick a side. Pick the side that makes sense, whether it's the side closest to the figure to keep attracting attention to the figure, or the side, out and away from the figure if the side closest to the figure is going to be in shadow, right? All right. Let's talk about chainmail. Chainmail, honestly, is one of the things people tell me they dread the most with NMM, and it is honestly the easiest thing. There is no way to really realistically paint it. Link by link, you're just not going to do it. So the easiest thing is to use a side brush, not a dry brush, a side brush, to gently pick out those links. So what I always do, you can do the whole base coat and wash thing. I actually like starting with black or near black and just painting in all the links. I find that I get darker shadows that way, and that the links stand out better. So here I'm just using a walnut brown. You can use black, you can use walnut. Anything near black will work. So there we go. We're going to let that dry for a second while I show you the brush technique. So you want to get a brush that's a decent size. I wonder if I've got, my Reaper Zero. A little bit bigger. I don't want it really big because I still want to be able to hit little details. This brush, of course, is a round. You can use, if you have a very small version of a flat or an angle chisel, you can use those. Doing a side brushing gentle technique like this works very well with those. But you don't have to have one in order to do this. You can just make your brush into a paddle. And the way you do that, let's just grab our medium gray here. Medium dark gray. So we get some paint in our brush. And then we begin by turning our brush over and over and over. This brush is actually kind of stiff, but you get the idea. So notice how sharp it is there. And notice how it's turning into more of a paddle there. This brush is pretty beat up, so let's try it with a little bit of a better brush. I'm going to use one of my regular sables. Just my Kolinsky sable. Let's do a little bit of a mix. I want a slightly lighter color. All right, so I've got paint on there. Boom, boom. I don't want these big puddles, by the way. Flat, flat. So you see how it's a paddle. If we turn on the edge, it's razor sharp, and you can paint with that edge too. But we want the paddle. We'll see if this has got enough body to it. Wait till everything is dry here. And you want to just use the very side of the brush to gently go over the top. And you can see you get an effect that's like dry brushing, only you don't have to be all random with it. You know how dry brushing is. You go back and forth and you have no control. This way, you have control. And you just have to, when you redip your brush, that's probably the most painful part. You have to go back and make your paddle again. Make sure, again, you don't want big puddles of paint coming off. Because if we had big puddles of paint here, it would all go down into those details, right? But we can essentially turn this brush into a temporary flat and gently, gently rub it across the surface. And that will get us. Now, we do want to leave, wherever we see a little kind of a dip in the chainmail, where it's kind of like curving inward. This is hanging pretty flat here, but there's a divot here and there's a little fold there. So we want to, just like with cloth, we want to leave the folds darker. I go over it a couple times. So right away, that's looking pretty good. But we're going to use our next highest color, the light gray. Again, I'm going to make my brush into a paddle. And then I'm going to keep that more toward the outer edge. And the reason is this guy's hunched over, so probably this top part is going to be kind of in shadow. It's also got that, it's underhang, right? You can see I've left it darker, but I'm going to keep my light coming up toward the outer edge here, where bounced light or light from above is going to pick up more as this stuff swings outward. So we're going to bring that up a bit. If I see an area that would get more light, I can concentrate on bringing that up toward the top a little bit more and down stronger by just pressing a little bit. You can see. If you totally wipe out your pattern, you do have a few tries. I always thin my paints for this reason, because if I do mess this up and I need to paint over it, this is pretty shallow texture. Not all chainmail is, but this is pretty shallow, so it would be easy to fill in detail if I was using my paint full strength. So when you start this, make sure you thin your paint down a little bit. Go like 4 to 1, 4 drops of paint to 1 drop of water, or something around that, or close, just a little thinned off of your paint coming straight out of the bottle. And that will give you a better result. Then finally, we'll grab our pure white. You don't want the paint too thin when you're doing these colors. You do want to thin it all, though. If you thin it, it's just going to be nicer coming off your brush. It won't be clumpy. And I'm just going to grab, see how I can bring that up? Grab the edges out here. A little bit of the edge here. And that is pretty good if you have an obvious fold where the light is going to go down the center. Let's say we wanted to depict this part as a fold instead of flat. Then I'd bring my white all the way up. And that suggests, right, that that this piece is curving. This is the easy way to do chainmail. Ta-da, easy. Super, super easy. If you want, you can still edge. Like, this is part of why I kind of went in the outside edge with this white. I probably wouldn't use pure white to edge down around the edges here. I would use a gray. So if you do want to pick out the edge down here on the bottom, as if there's bounced light, just pick it up with a little bit of gray. All right, there you are. And that is the easy way to do chainmail. It's just a very gentle, I call it side brushing, because essentially you're painting with the side of the brush. More so if you're painting like with this, but turning it into a paddle, it's a very, very light touch, and you're painting on the side, so you're not actually doing this. You're actually trying to do this. So you are painting with the side of the tip at the very least, the tip being paddle shaped. All right? Remember to keep very little paint on your brush so you don't fill in those little divots, but you don't need to take as much paint off as you do with dry brushing. And that's great because it means you can use a good brush for this without ruining it. All right, everybody, let's call it there. Now, I will be doing a companion PDF for this, which will have pictures on my Patreon for the $2 tier, just so you know. So that'll be patreon.com/paintingbig. I'll have that up in probably a few days. And then next month, we're going to carry on with more NMM. I'm probably going to take a break after a few of these videos to just toss in some content on other things that are conceptual, like maybe some source lighting, some glowing object type stuff, just for a break. But mostly, I want these lessons to all link together in kind of a logical format so that you guys come out of this with a pretty good grounding in the basic ways to think about NMM. Always keeping in mind, there are always different ways to do it. Different painters are going to teach it differently. They may actually teach it in a way that makes more sense to you. That's cool. Just like, I want to give you some kind of foundation to think about light so that you can carry that with you until you find the way that really clicks for you, and then you can do it without having to agonize over it. All right? Excellent. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll be back at you next month. This is Anne signing off.